Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you become a literary expert. So if this sounds like what you need, then make sure that you hit the subscribe button below. So in today's video, we are exploring the theme of love in Tennessee Williams' play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Now, in a play where almost all characters have such exaggerated personalities and egos, is there really still room for them to love each other truly? And perhaps more tellingly, do they even love themselves? Now, love is arguably the most universal literary theme of all time, and it's a concept so broad that people necessarily understand it very differently, as their view of what constitutes love would be formed by their own unique experiences and childhood. In courtship, love may seem more like an intense feeling, a sort of infatuation and obsession with a specific person. But as a relationship graduates to the stage of marriage, perhaps love would take on a more mature dimension, where husband and wife compromise, sacrifice, and accept the other person unconditionally, all the while hopefully maintaining their own values, principles, and boundaries. Now that's probably the ideal, healthy kind of marital love, but reality is often far from perfect, because humans are flawed and people get into relationships with all sorts of trauma and baggage. And indeed, this baggage-laden kind of love seems to dominate in Streetcar, as the two main romantic relationships, the marital one between Stella and Stanley, as well as the prospective romance between Mitch and Blanche, aren't exactly exemplars of wholesome, healthy, boundaried love. And despite the deep attachments to each other, it's a moot point as to whether any of these characters truly love each other in the way that we have just defined it, or whether they have simply identified in the other person a gaping hole of loneliness and a bucket full of vulnerability that makes a potent recipe for toxic codependency and superficial validation. Now, for Tennesee Williams himself, as a homosexual man in the early 20th century American South, where conservative values were deeply entrenched and homosexuality was either deemed taboo or unacknowledged, the question of what it means to develop romantic and loving attachments to another person, and whether that comes with danger and abandonment, would have been all the more acute and confusing for him. It's bitterly ironic that in an interview with Williams' mother, she mentioned that her son had decided early on in his life that he never intends to marry because he can't bear to make another woman unhappy, indicating that for most of his life, an intellectual exploration of love did not quite translate into courage for a deep personal experiencing of love. Now, regardless, we see from this play that Williams' portrayal of marital nuances and dynamics are sharp and poignant, but perhaps carrying influences of Southern Gothic grotesque that exaggerates interpersonal drama in such a melodramatic and turbulent way as to make their relationships not quite realistic to certain audience tastes. But anyway, in the rest of this video, we're going to dive deeper into the relationships portrayed in this play, and specifically how the idea of love, dysfunctional, misguided, or otherwise, is played out in these relationships variously. So with that, let's get straight into it. Now, people often say that opposites attract, and while it certainly seems that way with Stella and Stanley's social backgrounds and outward temperaments, the couple actually share a point of similarity that glues them together. Paradoxically, they love each other for the insecurity and anxiety that the other person calls up within themselves. Stella loves Stanley because his unbridled energy and primal dynamism are precisely those qualities she lacks but deeply wishes she had. While Stanley is drawn to Stella because the fact that a Southern belle would accept and even admire a coarse commoner like him is very much flattering to his ego. But actually, these sources of so-called love double also as reminders of lack, of what each person doesn't and can never acquire through their personal effort. For most of the play, Stanley is presented in a hyper-macho light, carrying himself with a sort of devil-may-care bluster and swaggering bombast. Yet there are two moments that stand out for showing him in a deeply vulnerable emotional state, both which reveal the extent of his love for, or at least his attachment to, his wife Stella. The first one comes when Stanley is drunk during the Scene 3 poker night, where he hits his pregnant wife, who then takes shelter in the flat of their upstairs neighbor, Eunice. Now, as you can see from this moment, there's an infantilizing tone in Stanley's reference to his wife as my baby doll. But there's also the interesting irony that when he cries, I want my baby down here, he could well be talking about both his wife and the baby that she's carrying in her womb. This suggests that Stanley views his pregnant wife not just as a marital partner, but also as the stewardess of his biological legacy. What's also significant is that in his howling and calling for his wife in this heaven-splitting violent manner, Stanley himself seems to have regressed to an infantile, baby-like state, with the auditorily accentuated Stella, Stella cries resembling the wails of a newborn babe, crying out for their mother's attention. Now this adds another layer to Stella's role in Stanley's life. She represents not only his present as his wife and his future as the mother of his child, but also his past as a surrogate mother who, like most mothers towards their sons, will hold a space where unconditional love and acceptance abound, regardless of the flaws and faults that the man exhibits. Indeed, in the moment immediately following this one, we see Stella descending the stairs, facing her contrite husband who kneels and places his head towards her belly, almost as if he were part of the growing infant. When Stella's eyes go blind with tenderness and she catches his head, she becomes the symbol of boundless maternal forgiveness, which reinforces the idea of Stella playing a tripartite, all-encompassing role for Stanley as being at once his mother, his wife, and the mother of his future child. And this is why Stanley is so desperate for Stella's presence in his life. She has become the central life source of his past, present, and future. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. The other moment where Stanley demonstrates love for his wife comes at the end of the play, when a distraught, guilt-ridden Stella collapses on the front porch while she looks on at her sister Blanche being taken away to a mental institution. For the audience, our response to Stanley in this moment becomes much more complicated and likely repulsed than in the previous scene that we had analysed, because by this point we know that Stanley has raped his sister-in-law, while his wife is choosing not to acknowledge this fact, as Eunice, her neighbour, counsels her, "Don't believe it, life must go on." Is it possible for a husband who has done such an act of deceitful betrayal to still truly love his wife? Now, interestingly, in this scene, there's an echo of Stella's earlier cries for his wife in the poker night scene in Stella's sad, sobbing cries for her sister here, who is taken away by the doctor and matron. Stella's grief is a reflection of her sisterly love for Blanche, and reflects that despite all the conflict Blanche has stirred up in her household, she remains on an emotional level deeply attached to her sister. Yet Stella's love for Blanche must take a back seat to the other aspects of her life which also demand her love, including her child, whom Eunice symbolically places in her arms as a reminder of Stella's new role now as a mother, and of course love for her husband, whose soothing coos and sensual fondling also function as reminders of Stella's ultimate allegiance, which is, of course, to Stanley, her husband, and not to Blanche, her sister. And this moment is emotionally challenging for the audience, because while it seems like there's genuine affection in Stella's desire to comfort his wife, as suggested by his refusal to return to the card table, but moving towards the porch and standing at the steps looking at Stella, his words, "Now, honey, now, love, now," convey a mix of reassurance but also condescension, almost as if he's narcissistically redirecting his wife's attention back towards himself, and ultimately for his own sexual fulfillment, which we can infer from the way his fingers find the opening of her blouse. In exchange for his love, Stella must serve his needs first and foremost, and this, above all, is the governing dynamic in their marriage. As the scene exits with the intermingling of Stella's luxurious sobbing, Stanley's sensual murmur, and the recurring melancholic tune of the blue piano, the overall impression that one gets from here is that Stanley and Stella's mutual love is a conflation of turbulent, contradictory, and often painful emotions, one that is always in flux and mostly unfathomable even to the person feeling it, and felt perhaps most palpably at points of loss and sadness. So we can see then that love can be possessive of our partner's physical presence and attention, but just as much a hunger for their emotional allegiance, as we see from Stanley's constant vying for Stella's loyalty vis-a-vis Blanche's attempts to separate the couple. So from Stella's vantage, love is a willful ignorance of her husband's faults and an unconditional acceptance of his flaws, even and perhaps willingly at the expense of her well-being, as evidenced in Stella's tolerance of her husband's unrestrained transgressions. And in the context of marriage, perhaps for love to be sustained, it has to be viewed as a kind of poker game, like the 7-card stud that Steve remarks as the final line of the play, because it requires delusion, secrecy, and a willing acceptance that what comes with the good will inevitably carry the bad, and that more often than not, maybe it's better for one to not know too much about the bad and to just go on with the business of real life. Now, if there's anyone who can be considered unlucky in love, Blanche is probably our poster representative. Neither marriage nor romance seems to have worked out for this woman, and men in general tend to either disrespect or disappoint her. Stanley mocks Blanche all the time, as he has no tolerance for her fastidious and hoity-toity behaviour, not to mention his cavalier rape of her at the end of the play, showing his gross disregard of her as an individual deserving of basic respect. Similarly, none of the men with whom Blanche got involved sexually back in Laurel at the Hotel Flamingo took her seriously in any way. Shep Huntley, if he's even real, and his gentlemanly generosity towards Blanche is kind of an imaginary fantasy that she's concocted for self-soothing, and her marriage to Alan was obviously a tragedy. First with her revelation of her homosexuality, and then having to live with the guilt over his suicide. And finally, even Mitch, who had seemed at one point to be her saving grace, abandons her after discovering the truth about her dark, promiscuous past. But the tragedy with Blanche is that despite her moral fallenness and self-sabotaging behaviour, she really just wants a safe emotional harbour and reassurance that she is enough just the way she is, despite her pathological obsession over her appearance, weight, and background. She desperately seeks out men's attention and validation because her sense of self is cripplingly fragile, and her upbringing in the southern heartland, where conservative gender values normalized female dependence on male partners, means that she doesn't know a better alternative to prop her sense of identity up in times of misfortune. That said, her understanding of love is not really as shallow as her actions may suggest, as we see in scene 6, when Blanche reveals to Mitch about her discovery of her ex-husband Alan's homosexuality and his subsequent suicide. When Blanche says that she made the discovery of love at the young age of 16, all at once and much, much too completely, perhaps the implication in this statement is that she didn't, in fact, understand love by that point when she married him. She acknowledges that she was deluded and taken in by her first husband's boyish nervousness, softness, and tenderness, which wasn't like a man, which had activated maternal protective instincts in her that perhaps she mistook for love. But the association that Blanche makes between loneliness and love shows that she had probably married Alan out of a desire to escape loneliness, without being prepared to offer him the level of genuine understanding and unconditional acceptance that real love requires. We know this because ultimately, upon discovering her husband's affair with an older man who had been his friend for years, she expressed her open disgust towards him on the dance floor that fateful night, which then, of course, triggered his deep shame and drove him to commit suicide. So indeed, Blanche's open repudiation of Alan's sexuality is a sign that she doesn't truly love him, and perhaps also a reflection of Williams's own paranoia about the sort of romantic abandonment that he might be subject to in relationships, given his status as a homosexual man in a social climate where his identity would have invited scorn and rejection. But by sharing this unfortunate anecdote and disastrous past to Mitch, Blanche opens up the possibility of a new, better relationship in which she can heal from those past hurts and be accepted for her lapses by Mitch, who, upon hearing this tale, feels a momentary connection to the woman that resembles something like the tenderness of loving acceptance that she so desires. While it may seem like Mitch has fallen for Blanche in her moment of vulnerable weakness, his emphasis on their mutual need of somebody suggests that his idea of love is denominated in the terms of transaction and grounded in codependency. For Mitch, a spouse is someone whom he can bring home to his mother as a testament to his conforming with conventional social behavior. And the spouse is the person upon whom he can rely as an emotional crutch rather than someone whose quirks and uniqueness he wants to actively explore. The hesitancy and phrasing of his question to Blanche, could it be you and me, Blanche? Foreshadows, in fact, his abandonment of her, because it signals that in Blanche he sees a figure to fill the gap of you in the generic pairing of a you and me, despite him saying earlier that she's not like anyone he's ever met before, which just really comes across like a hackneyed remark most men would use in the early stages of courtship. This foreboding quality then compounds the dramatic irony of Blanche's exclamation that sometimes they discard so quickly towards the end of the scene, because while it reveals that she sees Mitch as her savior and refuge, he nonetheless ultimately discards and disappoints her like so many of the other men after Mitch finds out that she is, just like any other human being, imperfect and liable to making missteps in life. So what Blanche and Mitch's relationship reflects then is that in moments of sudden raw vulnerability, it can be easy for two people's judgment about each other's suitability as romantic partners to be clouded by their own emptiness, loneliness, and desperation for validation. The other person's brokenness may seem attractive in the instant because it mirrors and validates our own broken parts, offering a kind of reassurance that we're not such grotesque people as to have been cast aside or so unlucky in love compared to the rest of humanity. But as Mitch's final disregard of Blanche clearly shows, this draw to shades of one's vulnerability does not mean a full acceptance of another's true self, which is the only foundation of real, sustained love. Now, as a final note, I think it's worth considering if real love is present at all in the play, or if all the characters somewhat misunderstand love as a form of possessiveness, control, enablement, codependency, and even violence. It's a classic paradox of love and hate being two sides of the same coin. If someone would at least care enough to expend angry or violent energy towards us, then isn't it fair to say that could also be a kind of love, albeit in a kind of twisted, perverse way? Of course, that's not the healthy kind of love, but a key question this play raises is whether much of romantic and marital relationships in real life is based on variations of dysfunctional loving. The real healthy kind of love is probably a rarity or even an ideal in a world where flawed humans are just seeking other flawed humans in moments of exceptional vulnerability. But then again, does loving a person have to come with suffering for the self and entail the sort of unconditional, unboundaried acceptance at the expense of our well-being and sanity? It shouldn't, really, but reality shows us that a lot of us, when in the so-called state of being in love or believing ourselves to love another person, will often embrace this misguided approach and confuse real love with problematic forms of emotional attachment. But this is always to our own detriment in the long run, as we see in the case of Stella's long-suffering tolerance and enablement of Stanley's transgressions, and Blanche's delusional fantasy of men's sexual exploitation as a reflection of her feminine value in their eyes. So I'd like to leave us all with a wonderfully poignant quotation about love that I came across recently in the philosopher and poet David Whyte's book, Consolations, which I think encapsulates the presentation of love in Streetcar in a much kinder and more empathetic way than what seems to be suggested by most of the criticism out there on the play. And here it is. And that, from the way I read Streetcar, crystallizes all the chaotic, complex, and deeply human dynamics of love in the play and in our daily lives. And there you go, everyone, my comprehensive analysis of the theme of love in Streetcar, which I hope has given you some refreshing insights into the characters and their relationship dynamics. Don't forget to check out my other analysis on 3 symbolic moments in Streetcar, which I will link right here. Please hit that thumbs up button below if you found this video helpful in any way, so that the YouTube algorithm will share it with other passionate lit students like yourself all around the world, and that you can encourage me to keep making these useful study videos for you. Please subscribe if you haven't already and switch on that bell notification so that you don't miss out on any of my future weekly videos. You can also consider joining my membership program for exclusive video requests and essay review perks. You can check that out by clicking the join button below. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!